very rewarding reason, and it's my great pleasure to introduce to all of you Dr. Tanya Corbin. Dr. Corbin is an old friend and a very valued colleague. She is, as she just revealed to you, a professor of political science. That's her training. Who has worked on disasters and disaster response and recovery for a long time in many different iterations. I think mainly focusing on the United States. And the politics and policy involved in disaster recovery. But I think especially now that she's integrating necessarily, I would add COVID-19 and pandemics into her research. It will take on more of a global perspective as well. I want to thank her for being very generous with her time and preparing what I know is going to be a very interesting talk. As we have done in the past, if you have questions or comments as Professor Corbin is making a presentation, please feel free to type them into the chat and we can get to them in the Q&A period. And then in addition, in the Q&A period, we can also use the raise hand function for any interaction that you might want to do that way. So Dr. Corbin, as you can tell from her title slide, is the department chair of a relatively new program at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Security and Emergency Services. So like we social scientists here at Illinois Tech, she is a political scientist helping to enlighten the future engineers and pilots and airline managers, et cetera, of the world. So Tanya, take it away.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that lovely introduction. I'm so happy to be here talking with you all today, and I'm looking forward to sharing a social science public policy perspective on disaster research. I'll highlight a few aspects of my own work as we go through. The way that we think about disasters and study them is changing, has changed quite a bit, and will continue to do so, as Jonathan alluded to. One thing I am going to ask is if you all will work with me and participate in a few questions as we go along. And I have Poll Everywhere software. For those of you who maybe haven't used it before, I promise it's very user-friendly. And so you can use it. Thank you, Matthew, for putting the link in there. You can use your phone and you can do it through text message. And if you want to use your phone and text, you can just message the 22333, and then you can type in Tanya Corbin 132, and then you'll start being able to answer the questions. If you're going to use the web, you can use the link that Matthew put in there, and you can use a computer, a laptop, phone. Just wait for the question and then start responding. Okay. And if you need the directions up there again, you'll see them right up there in case you miss them. So I'll give everybody a chance to kind of get logged in and think about this, but let's just think together about, if you were going to hazard a guess, what percentage of people in the world have been affected by a disaster in the last year, in the whole world, in the last year? Yeah, I see lots of interesting answers coming in here. Yeah, 80, 100, 5, millions. Yeah. Other thoughts? I'm going to give people a little time to log in the first time. I see a hand raise.
Miss, you want a number? Because I'm the person who said millions, but like.
Yeah, it is. I think maybe percentage. Like half the people, 100% of the people, 0% of the people. That kind of thing.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to nail those numbers down. That's really hard to get an exact number. Okay, I see some more coming in. So the person who guessed 100% is right, or multiple people maybe. And the reason for that is COVID-19. So the whole world has been affected by COVID-19 in some way or another in the past year. And so you might be saying to yourself, if you're a skeptic, sure, Tanya, that's fine. But that's an outlier year. Most of the time, it's not such a high percentage. And so, okay, let's step it back and let's think about just the United States. And let's think about just weather-related disasters. So if we take COVID-19 off the table and we think about who has been affected by a disaster just in the US, and actually let's just go for the summer. We just came out of summer, and what percent of the population do you think has been affected just by a weather-related disaster in the past summer? And sure, you could Google this for the answer, but it's much more fun to guess. So yeah, put some guesses up. Yeah, we have a wide range of answers coming in. 30 to 40, 65. Nobody's going for 100, I guess. I'll give you just another minute or two. It's 80. Yeah, these are great guesses. So the right answer is pretty much up there. 32%, the U.S. population just this past summer, and that doesn't include COVID. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what it might mean to experience more than one disaster at the same time, which is becoming increasingly common. But yeah, so about a third of the population. And just to give you a sense of, these are 18 different billion-dollar weather and climate disasters from the summer. And so you can see, and that includes Ida. This is so far this year, and this comes, I think the end date was October 8th here. So we're really in real time. We're about a week behind. So you can see, you might be getting the picture that disasters are widespread and affecting tons of people here. So we know what a disaster is intuitively. We hear a lot about it in the media, talk a lot about it. Sometimes we talk about it just like our day was a disaster, right? But what does it really mean from a social science perspective to define a disaster? What is it? And I know I'm talking to a lot of tech folks, and so I'm going to give you sort of a social sciencey, squishier definition or thinking about this. So for social science, disasters are really relatively sudden occasions, and the key thing that we're thinking about with them is that they are disruptive to our routines, our collective social units. And so you have to take some unplanned courses of action. And so for us, disasters are inherently social phenomena. And so we are thinking about them as involving natural hazards, but not being the natural hazard. And so they are really, for an interesting thing to think about that surprises people, I think, is disasters are not natural. Even when they're weather related, or even when they're related to a hazard, we don't think of them as natural. Disasters for us are partially a function of the built environment and partially a function of the interaction between the built environment and societal and individual vulnerabilities, our economic systems, our social systems, our political systems. And so making that distinction for us is pretty important. If I'll give you an example, if we have a volcano that explodes on an island, erupts on an island, but nobody lives on the island, it's really not a disaster. It's really just a hazardous event. It's a hazard, and it's an event. So if a hurricane stays offshore, it's a natural hazard, but it's not a disaster. So really for us, it's when the people are involved that it becomes a disaster. So that's how we think about it. And so we can think a little bit shifting here. I, in particular, think about the roles of governments in disasters. When we think about it, social science as a social phenomenon, I think about the roles of governments. And so I'd like to ask you what you all think the roles of governments, different governments, are in disasters. And just to clarify, my brother thought that I meant, did governments cause disasters? Were governments themselves disasters? I'm more thinking about the ways in which governments may support or interact or prepare at all stages: mitigation, resilience, response, recovery. So, what do you think, Mike? What do you think they might do, or even what you think they should do? Give you guys a few minutes to type your answers in. Yeah, preparing for contingencies, a mitigation plan in place, recovery when they strike, right? Absolutely, all of those. Maybe also they should they should what? Oh, reduce and mitigate disaster effects. Yeah, yeah. All things we hope they will do. It takes resources, aid. They should predict but build infrastructures to protect citizens. Recovery when possible, relocation when necessary. Yeah, we'll be thinking a lot about relocation in the future, won't we? Um, we're already thinking about that in Alaska and Louisiana, in our country. Yeah, these are great answers. Yeah, and I don't see response in here, but that's usually the thing people think about the most when they're thinking about disasters, because the media cover that the most, right? They cover response. But all of these things are the bigger picture of what we hope we can think about with disaster and the role of government. And so these are all things that I'm thinking about too. I want to talk just a little bit about the role of government and how things changed and what kind of policymaking happened after Hurricane Katrina. I'll tell you, I've done quite a bit of research on Hurricane Katrina. I came to this. This is actually, Hurricane Katrina is actually what brought me to disasters. And Hurricane Katrina changed the way that social science thinks about and studies disasters in several important ways. So it increased our attention to the role of social science and policy studies in understanding disasters, and really shifted us away from the kind of structural environment, the built environment, and the hazardous events. And so it was, I've taken on several projects after Hurricane Katrina, and I'll tell you, it happened right as I was working, getting ready to start my dissertation. And I watched it unfold on TV because I didn't live in New Orleans anymore. But it was personal for me because my family is all from New Orleans and my friends are there. And I watched them go back and collect a pillowcase worth of belongings after this was over. And I watched them wade through a horrendous recovery, a horrendous response. And I really I couldn't believe that there were so many governmental failures on so many levels. And so it brought me to study Hurricane Katrina, and I'll just talk a little bit about that. One of the projects I worked on was looking at the federal kind of policy advocacy by people who are usually left out of the political process. Historically marginalized populations, advocacy organizations. And so I was looking at congressional testimony, 240 witnesses who testified after the Hurricane Katrina. And there were 41 hearings. And it was really remarkable to find that people who usually aren't invited to the table to discuss policy issues were there. And so they were raising these really these issues that we hadn't really talked about after disasters before. Typically, when a disaster happens in the United States before Katrina, it's distributive politics. You go, you get some money for your district, you bring it back, you build your bridge, you fix the things, and you go on. And it wasn't very partisan, it wasn't very controversial. But this time, they were inviting people and they were raising issues about race, about class, about governmental coordination or the lack thereof, political coordination, and environmental justice and climate change discussions came to the forefront. We first started talking about them. So it's great to have them at the table, have people at the policy table, but what happens? So 10 years later, I've traced this out to see, well, did we have any real policy change after? Was there substantive change? And in some ways, there was change. There was a major act in 2006 that reformed FEMA. People weren't able to bring their pets, for example, to shelters when they were evacuating, and so they didn't want to leave their pets behind. So that's something that changed. That was a really positive change that we made. We made other changes too. We didn't make the major change that all of the disaster scholars were advocating for, which was the removal of FEMA from the Department of Homeland Security to re-elevate it to a cabinet level position. And so we didn't see that happen. But we did see some changes. Unfortunately, though, we did not see changes in the social science kinds of issues and the social justice issues that were raised. We did not see changes. Those are harder, and so it's understandable in some ways. But it's one thing to make an issue, to get an issue onto the policy agenda, but it's another thing to have the issues end up and result in change. And so this article I just published this in Environmental Justice 15 years later, looking at Hurricane Katrina and revisiting the progress on environmental justice concerns as they relate to disasters, particularly. And so I think there's some optimism right now because there's an environmental justice working group working interagencies to work on this. And so I think we're making some progress there. But I don't want to talk just about Katrina. I do want to situate Katrina as a significant event that helped us think about disasters differently. We've continued to change the way we think about them. And increasingly, we're facing these transboundary complex events in disasters. And so what do I mean by transboundary? What do I mean by complex events? Well, transboundary disasters and also crises are unique. If you think about the kind of social science definition of these, we think about them as really the key is that they cross political boundaries. They often involve international cooperation, political boundaries are crossed. They spread quickly over a large geographic area. There's ambiguity about the kind of characteristics and the event impacts that we're going to see from them. And they affect a large number of people, right? Directly and indirectly. So transboundary events are big. And as in all disasters, but especially in a transboundary type of disaster, we need to think about extensive improvisation because we will find our existing plans, our procedures really to be inadequate. And we'll find our typical formal response organizations really can't address all the needs. And so what we see is emergent groups or new kind of spontaneous self-organizing groups, especially with social media, will emerge. So for people like me who study political questions in disasters and policy change, these events are raising a lot of questions without clear answers. And so some of the things that we're thinking about in these big transboundary disasters, who will manage these? Who will coordinate them? Big questions about resources. Resources are scarce and the needs are great. And are we going to make these decisions based on the best policies? What kind of political considerations come to play? One of the tried and true axioms in political science is that our elected officials are single-minded seekers of re-election. And So they're going to be responsive to public opinion, and oftentimes thinking about disasters, especially all of the things you all named, thinking about mitigation and resilience and those long-term questions, aren't always conducive to short-term election concerns. So lots of questions to think about in terms of these transboundary and complex events. And so just to kind of think more about these complex events, we see more compounding and cascading disasters happening. And so what do I mean by that? Well, we're asking the complexity of the events is about the intergovernmental coordination within and across the nation states. But we're also thinking about what happens when these regions experience disasters simultaneously at the same time. Or a bigger question, what happens when one region experiences repeated disasters, as happening in Louisiana right now? What role does the governmental agency, the elected official, what do they have in answering these questions? And so you can think a little bit about what and I'm about to ask you guys to do another poll, so you'll stay awake with me. Now, ask you to think a little bit about these kind of compounding and cascading disasters. So a cascading disaster might be a disaster that triggers other disasters and becomes, so the kind of example that comes to mind that people are really familiar with is, you can think about it on 3/11 in Japan, we had a major earthquake, and then that triggered a tsunami. And then that tsunami triggered a nuclear meltdown. That's an incredibly complex and massive disaster, and it's a cascading disaster. And so how do we deal with these? And what are the political and policy ramifications of dealing with these? So questions that we're grappling with. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about lately is thinking about what happens when our resources, and this is in the US, are stretched really thin. So we had in 2017, 3 hurricanes back to back. So what happens when Maria hits and wipes out Puerto Rico? Well, we have huge displacement questions. Just like we did after Katrina, we had huge displacement issues here in Central Florida, many Puerto Rican evacuees. And so how does the host city or state or country, if it's a kind of transboundary, how do they help support all of these displaced communities? There's some really big questions to think about. So I've just kind of went over with you, what a transboundary, a complex disaster is. Can you think of any disasters yourself that you might consider to be, that come to mind, that you either maybe your friends or family have experienced them, or maybe you have, but just some popular in the news disasters that could be transboundary, they could be complex. We already kind of named COVID-19, right? Other events you think of. Yeah, for sure. COVID-19 is a big one. The biggest one we've seen so far, right? Fires in the Amazon. Absolutely. Global implications there. Yeah. Yes, the tsunami. Absolutely. Climate change. Yeah, climate change for sure, right? Transboundary, it's the biggest one. Pandemics. Yeah, these are great. These are all really good examples. The volcano that impacted flights. Yeah, we think a lot about those kind of things here at Embry-Riddle. Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, I remember that. Those are all really good examples, really good examples. So you can think about these transboundary and complex events. We don't define them solely by billions of dollars, but this graph from NOAA gives us a nice takeaway, a nice way to think about and visualize. I shouldn't say nice, but it's not nice to have this many disasters. But if you can have a look at this graph, you can really see these are billion-dollar disaster events. And you can see that they're increasing. You can see that disasters like this are on the rise. So I think it's important to be thinking about how these are going to change the way we live, really. And so this does bring us to COVID-19, right? We think about transboundary disasters. We think about these large, complex disasters. And so I've started to work on COVID-19 because it is really a transboundary, long duration event, right? And so it raises some really important questions. You know, the questions I just asked you in the earlier slides, I'm applying to the state level pandemic planning that we're looking at. My team is looking at with me. You know, what happens when COVID-19 starts and it was mostly delegated to the states to handle, the governors, the state legislatures, and then the state emergency management agencies. And so we're looking at their plans to see what they had in place and watching those evolve over time. And so, you know, a really big question in my mind is what happens when we have our government, our elected officials, and our agencies, our emergency management agencies, engaging in real-time policymaking and policy implementation. So, you know, an average response time to a sort of typical disaster, if there is such a thing, but an average response time lasts about 72 hours. Well, we're still responding to COVID-19. We're still in the response phase. And I know that a lot of people wish that wasn't true, but that from a disaster phases perspective, we are definitely in the response phase. And so we're getting close. We'll probably be in it for 2 years. And so what happens when policies that are attempted to slow the virus and the spread are enacted at these state and local levels? How do we decide which policies to implement? And you can see, watching this unfold across the US, that there was a wide variety. Were they based on science? Were they based on politics? Were they based on public opinion? Yes, yes, yes. And so what are the effects of these politics and these policymaking decisions on public health, on your health, on society? And so I've started to look at those, and my partner, Dr. Courtney Tan, and I have just published, what's forthcoming, a look at some protective policies, and at the county level, looking at the policies that were enacted to see what happens. Do they work? Did they reduce the deaths from COVID-19, particularly in communities that have higher vulnerability and higher risk? And we found, yes, they did. So they do work. They're not perfect, and there's a wide range of policies that some work better than others, but yeah, they really decrease the deaths. And so we're thinking more about what these policies mean going forward. And I just wanted to share with you a little bit of work that's going on with the NSF-funded Converge working groups. And this is through the Natural Hazard Center. And it's a really amazing undertaking. So right when COVID-19 started, Converge and NSF funded some working groups working on public health and social science research about COVID-19. And so I think the thing that is really interesting for us as researchers and scholars and members of society to think about with this research is it really is generally inspired by a compelling problem. This kind of convergence research is very unique that way. And it's not just interdisciplinary, but it's really kind of transdisciplinary. So as experts come from different disciplines and pursue their common research challenges, we're sharing our knowledge, our theories, our methods, our data, and we're building new frameworks and building new paradigms, hopefully. Sometimes you can build new disciplines out of this. So this is underway, and really they're doing amazing, important work. This is just a photo of the COVID-19 working group that I'm a co-lead with Dr. Samantha Montano, and we're studying emergency management and policy analysis in a pandemic. And that's our working group, and so far, we've been studying the state pandemics. We're just at the start of this. And so I think these are really prescient questions for the future. And so I just want to leave you with some thoughts about future research directions, both for myself and for disaster scholarship and disaster research in an interdisciplinary level. And then I want to hear from our tech folks and our engineers to think about what you all might be thinking in these areas. But somebody raised this in our last poll, but climate change. I think, and Jonathan might remember me telling him this when I first went to Alaska. I said, oh no, I'm studying disasters, but I'm not going to study climate change. It's just so big and it's too much. And, well, the time has come that I really can't take that stance anymore, because all of our disasters are becoming complex and intertwined with the changes that are happening from climate change. And so it's a slow onset, long duration disaster. And there was just an article out in Nature Climate Change journal article, just published. 85% of the world is already being affected by climate change. And so, and I think Jonathan can speak to this more than I can, but I think we're just at the beginning of this. So I think this is a really good area for that converge type research and new frameworks. And so finding new frameworks in general for disaster research is it's really important right now, and getting out of our disciplinary silos. That's actually been one of the great joys of working on disaster scholarship. And so, and of course, what first brought me to disaster research, thinking about the politics and the policy making that's going on around disasters. And I think that we are also, much like climate change, I remember 10 years ago talking about disaster politics becoming more partisan and more polarized. And I think we've only seen the escalation of that, right, through COVID-19 and as time has gone on. So I think we really need to grapple with how we can make and move forward and offer the best disaster mitigation, response, recovery, resilience, building resilience in our societies in an increasingly polarized and partisan kind of environment. So that's what I'm thinking about. But what are you all thinking about? I just want to know, thinking about your own research interest, or if you're a student, what are you studying that you're interested in? What kinds of questions would you and your colleagues think about investigating related to disasters? It doesn't have to be a disaster question. I've heard some really cool things with AI and machine learning that I don't know anything about, people are doing really neat things with. Falsification of the atmospheric CO2 greenhouse effects. Oh, I hope we talk about this in the discussion. Super interesting. Other thoughts? Transboundary disaster. Accountability. Accountability for causing a transboundary disaster. Oh, interesting. Yeah. Yeah, we always think about it from a mitigation side. We don't think about accountability. Economic effects of disaster. Huge, huge area. Yeah. Yeah. We need more economists working on this. The class and racial dimensions of disaster impact. Yeah. A lot of good social science research coming out. Yeah, really good ideas. other thoughts? Give you just about 20 more seconds. The involvement of AI to predict disasters and respond quickly. I'm so interested in that topic too. I know nothing about it. Yeah. Okay. Well, these are really fantastic research agendas. So at this point, I'd just like to say thank you for joining the talk and hearing, and I look forward to your questions and your discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dr. Corbin. Really appreciate you sharing your research and your thoughts and giving us a real-time opportunity with some new software to share ours as well. I'm not seeing anything in the chat, so let's move to real time. And if you would kindly use the hand raise function. Newfall, you have your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Hi, Miss. Doctor, sorry. I'm the one.
Oh,
Oop, we lost you.
oh no.
I think his Wi-Fi might have went out. It'll probably go back on in a few minutes.
Okay.
Actually, Dr. Corbin, I just had a question about your research. When you said that 85% of the population was being affected by climate change, how did you measure 85%?
Oh, well, thank you for thinking that was my research. That was not my research. I wish I had done that. That is a study that just came out, and the journal is Nature Climate Change. And it was published on October 11th, so it's really fresh out. And actually, it was machine learning. And so there was a mapping of 100,000 climate impact studies. It's really interesting. Here, I'll drop the link in the chat.
If I could interject a question there before we get back to Newfall, I'll give you a chance to finish your thought. But how is affected defined? Because you could arguably say that the answer to any of your questions is 100%.
And it will be soon if it's not now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this again is not my research, but I think that I put that link in the chat. They were looking at the other climate impact studies and doing a meta-analysis on 100,000 of those. And so if those studies found effects, and they took all of those and then it mapped out to be 85%.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. I'll have to read the article. I
mean, this is getting out, I think it's a really important research question, but it's definitely out of my area.
Sure. Yeah, Newfall, go ahead.
Hi. So first of all, I just wanted to say thank you for your presentation. It was a great presentation. I think coming from an angle where sociology is now more and more required as our society is, expanding on it. I mean, we do have to agree that sociology was created very recently. I mean, very close. So I think Emil Durkheim, one of the founder of sociology, would say that that everything in society impacts each other, right? Every corner. So I think it would be obvious for governments to do some work on it, right? To try to to work on it, but also we need to, sociology would also argue that we need to work with other on other topics, like how does climate change really affect things. And my family gave me this work called The Falsification of the Atmospheric CO2 Greenhouse Effects Within the Frame of Physics by Gerald Gerlich. And I just wanted to know your, there's still a lot of physics doctors in Europe, I don't know about the US, who would argue that climate change is just a behavior of the Earth. So I just wanted to have your take on this, and how sociologists, how sociologists will work with physicists whose point of view is not really derived on that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So This is, and you are actually touching on exactly why I told Jonathan when I went to Alaska that I didn't want to work on climate change. But, I wanted to work, and I'm a US politics scholar. So, I'm not an international scholar. So I'm really not the best one to be, actually it's a better question for Dr. Rosenberg. But I will say that I think, to your point of sociologists and social scientists, I have a bachelor's degree in sociology, so I'm a long ways away from it, but I do work with a lot of sociologists now. And I do think that, I think the questions about, you've really touched on why the politics and the policymaking aspects of disasters are so important, right? Because if we can't find that common ground to start with, we're never really going to get to the point where we're making a concerted and a progressive effort, to mitigate the worst effects for all disasters, And so I think that some of the biggest questions that I don't have answers to, but I hope we can find answers to as a society and as a in the U.S. especially, where I live, and think most of the time, figuring out the common ground has to be a priority, because I don't think if we can make any real progress on policy until we start at a common place. And I used to think that was really easy to do because, well, everybody has experienced a disaster or has known someone or lives in a place that's at risk. But, it turns out I was terribly wrong. So,
yeah, I would say like the problem is like, you have fields like politicians don't get along. But I think, if we're looking at the outside the box, we also see that doctors in the medical field or the science field don't get along as well. They disagree on how we could resolve issues like disasters, and the problem is it's not only politics. I think it's something that spans along across of other fields, and I think, for example, we have NASA working on disasters. We had a person from NASA coming and giving a speech to a seminar to us. So he also talked about how NASA is working a major role. So maybe I feel like maybe the NASA is doing a better role than some government agencies. I don't know.
Again, NASA's pretty popular over here at Embry-Riddle. We're actually starting a master's program in space operations. So, I think I think that you are really touching on a lot of important ideas and in discussion, and I think that science is hard because it's always evolving. And I think that's something we've seen with COVID-19, right? As the science changes and as we learn more, it can be very difficult to translate that and to keep up with that and, to be open to that. And science also, my family likes to tease me because when we're social scientists or whatever kind of scientists we are, we tend to speak in a little bit softer way. We say, the research seems to show that. We don't say, I am positive that this is happening, right? That's just not the way we talk, because we always are learning and we always are standing on the shoulders of the people before us. And we're always in conversation with other scholars. And so, it would be great if we could definitively declare all of the right things to do and just do them. But unfortunately, and especially in social science, that's just not the way it is.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah. Tanya, would you mind if I waited on this a little bit? Because the international politics dimension of this is interesting, and you both really brought out some important points. And the mention of NASA I think is particularly telling there. Technology actually, in terms of overcoming falsification of climate change data, has helped quite a bit. The ability to use satellite technology, for example, to independently measure and disseminate data has helped, because in international politics, typically the governing underlying principle is sovereignty, meaning that each state has exclusive control of what happens within its territory, and that is included in intergovernmental organizations like the UN and its agencies, that they depend on the countries themselves to provide them with the data. And so the data comes through various political and economic filters before before it gets to the international agencies. Having technology that allows us to run a circle around that has been quite helpful.
Yeah. I think like it's just like so for the United Nations and other organizations too, they don't have the prevailing technologies or the finance of a huge finance from a huge investment from the government. The UN, for example, will not be able to send a satellite as easily as NASA, because the United Nations is like, it's like an NGO, right? So we cannot expect it to do much work without having the support of one country all alone.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other hands up? Any additional questions? I'm sure the new phone and I could engage Dr. Corbin endlessly for hours, but we don't want to monopolize the opportunity. Okay, I'll fill the breach gladly then, because I have a number of questions. One thing that you didn't mention is the role of NGOs, and one thing that I always struck by, especially in immediate post-disaster scenarios in the United States, is an almost institutionalized expectation that the Red Cross is going to be there, just to mention one, and fulfill an essential function. What does that mean for the responsibilities and responses of government?
Well, thanks for asking me that question, because that's actually another something I've studied quite a bit, is the emergent groups too. It is absolutely the backbone of all disaster response, and a lot of the recovery falls on local. Both, there are those big national organizations, right, like the Red Cross, like you mentioned, and then there's also this kind of structural, each state has a VOAD, a voluntary organizations after disasters, active in disasters, and you can go to the website voad.org and you can see each, Red Cross or the Salvation Army is really active, Second Harvest, lots of people. And they're working together and they're really integrated into response, especially, and then somewhat into recovery. But that we would absolutely collapse without them. We would absolutely collapse. And so, but there's a lot of frustration when I was conducting interviews after the 2016 Louisiana floods. There was I met some really interesting people working in these, what we call emergent groups. And they were talking about, the Red Cross, it's costing them $10 to put together this tiny little meal, and it takes them 3 days to get to us. Well, I just went and made a big pot of jambalaya, and I fed 10,000 people. And I said, yeah, but you didn't have to follow the health codes. You didn't have to, And so there's these other things, right? But at the heart of it, there's just such a deep desire to help your community when something happens, and we rely on that. We absolutely rely on that, and especially with the sort of emergent spontaneous groups that we've seen after the 2017 hurricanes too. We see them all the time. You might have heard of the Cajun Navy. They are spontaneous group that, when you are also at risk of constant flooding, you have a boat, and you're used to going out in the boat and getting people out, and you look after your neighbors. And oftentimes those groups can get there much faster because they're there, and they know Susie needs her insulin down the street, so they're going to go get Susie. And so it's really, really important. I'd love to see us kind of find a more formalized way to support those groups, actually. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
So wait, in the US, right? Because I know when a person does charity, they can offset it with their tax, right? Is there a correlation with every time there is a disaster in the US that multi-corporation, multinationals would just donate money and just offset their taxes just to help and and do like advertising their brand positively, like.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's something I think we need an economist to study, actually. But I will say, if you ever do want to help in a disaster, that is absolutely the best way you can help, is to send money, and send it to an organization you trust. And there's lots of ways to vet them. But a lot of times what we find is the desire at the individual household level to help. And so, after after the 2016 floods in Louisiana, which, if you haven't been to Louisiana, let me just tell you, it is hot, and it is hot all year, and it is really hot. And so they ended up with all these people opened up their closets and went through and wanted to donate things. Nobody needs your winter coat in September in Louisiana, after they've had a disaster. And so it actually becomes sort of another disaster management quandary, what to do with these massive piles of goods that you really can't use. And so they are creating a secondary problem, right? And so I think sending money, send money. If you can send money.
Oh, yeah.
Mhm.
Oh, yeah, because you did talk about the complexity of having other problems spam along one massive problem, just like the tsunami in Japan, right? Mm.
Mhm.
Oh,
Okay, how? Yeah. Hal, go
Yeah.
ahead.
Yeah, thank you for your great talk. So I just wondering, currently it seems you talking about a lot of these, like how we mitigate and reduce after the disaster. So how do you think is proactive for actions actually before disaster, such as like we know like New Orleans has the Katrina all the time since the geography locations. So there's an argument that actually we shouldn't build a house there at all. So which means then we don't actually have for these suffer these disasters. But it also have people think actually this will actually disrupt the social capital, so remove all the social capital things. So how do you think actually this kind of trade-off or balance between proactive actions and the disaster mitigation or reduction?
Yeah, that's a great question and a really important one. And, I've heard so many people say, well, you shouldn't be living in New Orleans. It's below sea level. And well, if you really took that approach, you start to look at the globe, we probably couldn't live in most of the places we live, right? If we said, well, what's the hazard risk, or what's the disaster risk here, or it really is about mitigation and planning ahead, right? And reducing and creating some resilience, some resilience to these events. And how do we do that? Well, social capital and social ties is definitely important in that. But also, we have to reform our policies. We have to make the National Flood Insurance Program just, I don't know if you guys have been following this. This is probably very boring to you, but it's so all of a sudden, most of my family can't afford flood insurance on their homes anymore, because the National Flood Insurance Program is trying to address the moral hazard of, subsidizing insurance so cheaply that people can just keep building back no matter how many times they flood in a place they shouldn't build, maybe. But there's some real justice and equity concerns here, right? Because we have to think about, well, that's great if you're a multimillionaire and you're building on the coast overlooking the ocean. Yeah, maybe we shouldn't subsidize your flood insurance. But what if your family has inherited this property and you can't afford to live anywhere else? And you can't afford to build back every time and keep insurance on it. And so, what happens to you in those cases? And so these questions, I think policy can really address a lot of these, good mitigation policy, good support structures, good ways to help people mitigate. We'll never eliminate our risk, but we can certainly build resilience and reduce our risk. When we talk about it, we talk about disaster risk reduction. We don't talk about elimination or, I don't know if does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Well, I think we're out of time. So thank you very much. As it become our tradition, if everyone would just type applause or thank you or
Thank you so much, man.
time
Thank
on
you.
air applause.
Doctor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Corbin, Tanya. It was great to see you again, and thank you for a very interesting presentation that stimulated a lot of thought. And a lot of
Thanks for the invitation. It was lovely to be here with you all. Really appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks
Okay, well,
everybody for attending too.
Thank you.
thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you. Bye.